The morning of February 24th, 1944, two SCR-584 radar sets had been rushed to the Anzio beachhead during the night, arriving just hours before dawn. The operators, specialists from the anti-aircraft artillery batteries, worked frantically in the darkness to dig the trailer-mounted systems into position. Above them, German artillery positions in the Alban Hills commanded a perfect view of the entire beachhead. Every square inch of the 7-mile-deep lodgment lay exposed to observation. For 5 weeks, German guns had pounded Allied positions with methodical precision. Shells fell on supply dumps, on field hospitals, on command posts, on troop concentrations. The Germans could see everything. They fired when they wanted, where they wanted, and there was nothing the Allies could do to stop them. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Then the radar sets came online. The 6-foot parabolic dishes began rotating, sweeping the sky with invisible microwave pulses. The operators watched green traces appear on circular display screens, aircraft contacts, showing range and bearing simultaneously. The SCR-584 had been designed to guide anti-aircraft guns against Luftwaffe bombers. It could detect aircraft at 40 miles. It could track them automatically. It could direct 90mm guns to fire with devastating accuracy, even in total darkness. But that night at Anzio, the operators would discover their radar could do something else entirely, something the designers at MIT's radiation laboratory had never fully anticipated. It could track artillery shells in flight, and if you could track where shells were going, you could calculate where they came from. The Battle of Anzio had begun on January 22nd, 1944, Operation Shingle, an amphibious landing 33 miles south of Rome, intended to outflank German defensive positions along the Gustav Line and force a breakthrough to the Italian capital. Major General John Lucas commanded the 6th Corps Landing Force. 50,000 men, 5,000 vehicles. British 1st Division landed north of Anzio. American 3rd Division landed at Anzio Port and Nettuno. The landings achieved complete tactical surprise. German forces in the area numbered fewer than 2 battalions. The road to Rome lay open, but Lucas hesitated. Instead of pushing inland immediately, he consolidated the beachhead. He brought ashore more troops, more supplies, more equipment. He prepared defensive positions. He wanted to ensure the beachhead could withstand counterattack before advancing. The German reaction was swift and devastating. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in Italy, immediately recognized the threat. Within hours, he had ordered every available unit to converge on Anzio. The code word was transmitted at 0200 hours. Richard, contingency plans already existed for exactly this scenario. Units from across Italy began moving. 71st Infantry Division from the Cassino Front, 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, elements of Hermann Göring Panzer Division, 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, heavy artillery battalions, reconnaissance units, anti-aircraft batteries. By January 23rd, German forces had established a screening line south of Rome. By January 25th, General Eberhard von Mackensen had arrived to take command of the newly formed 14th Army. 3 divisions formed a defensive crescent around the beachhead: 65th Infantry Division, 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, Hermann Göring Division. Behind them stood first-rate reserve formations: 29th Panzer Grenadier, 26th Panzer. The Iron Ring was complete, and then the Germans brought up their artillery. Heavy guns, long-range guns, guns positioned in the Alban Hills with perfect observation over the entire Allied lodgment. The beachhead was only 7 miles deep and 15 miles wide. Flat marshland, no cover, no concealment. German forward observers could see every movement, every vehicle, every supply dump, every troop concentration. The artillery fire began immediately and never stopped. 24 hours a day, random harassment fire at night, concentrated bombardments during the day. The psychological effect was devastating. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere safe. Men dug foxholes and stayed in them. Supply convoys moved at night and hoped Field hospitals were hit repeatedly. The port facilities were targeted constantly. Ships offshore came under fire. The Allies called it systematic terror bombardment. The Germans called it appropriate use of available firepower. By mid-February, 450 Allied artillery pieces in the beachhead were firing 20,000 rounds per day, trying to suppress German batteries. It wasn't working. The Germans had superior observation. They could see where Allied counter-battery fire was landing and adjust. Allied artillery observers couldn't see the German gun positions in the hills. Sound-ranging units tried to locate batteries by the sound of guns firing. Flash-spotting teams tried to pinpoint positions by observing muzzle flashes at night. Both methods required multiple observation posts working simultaneously. Both required precise survey work to establish positions. Both took time, and the German batteries moved frequently. Shoot-and-scoot tactics, fire a concentration, then displace before counter-battery fire could arrive. The Germans had been refining these methods since World War I. The Allied situation at Anzio was desperate. General Lucas was replaced on February 22nd by Major General Lucian Truscott. German counterattacks had nearly broken through to the sea. Operation Fishfang on February 16th had driven a wedge over a mile deep into American positions. Only massive artillery concentrations had stopped the assault. The beachhead held, but barely, and the German artillery never let up. By late February, Allied casualties at Anzio totaled over 30,000, 7,000 killed, 24,000 wounded or missing, and another 44,000 hospitalized from disease, malaria from the marshes, trench foot from the waterlogged positions, battle fatigue from the constant shelling. The operation was supposed to last days. It had turned into a months-long siege, and the Germans still held all the high ground. The technology that would change everything had been developed thousands of miles away at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The radiation laboratory, established in December 1940 after the Tizard mission brought British cavity magnetron technology to the United States. The magnetron was a breakthrough. It generated high-power microwave signals in a compact device. This allowed radar sets to operate at much shorter wavelengths than previous systems. Shorter wavelengths meant better resolution, better accuracy, better range discrimination. The SCR-584 project began in January 1941. The goal was an automatic tracking anti-aircraft radar that could guide guns to shoot down enemy bombers at night or in weather. The system used conical scanning. The radar beam rotated around the antenna axis to track the target automatically. The operator simply had to lock onto a contact, and the system would follow it. Range, bearing, and elevation data fed directly to the M9 gun director. The M9 was an analog computer developed by Bell Laboratories. It calculated firing solutions and automatically positioned 4 90mm anti-aircraft guns. The entire system represented the cutting edge of fire control technology. The first prototype was tested in April 1942. Within weeks, it was shooting down drone aircraft with as few as 8 rounds. Traditional anti-aircraft methods required hundreds of rounds to achieve a single kill. The SCR-584 and M9 combination changed that completely. Production contracts were signed immediately. Chrysler Corporation manufactured the systems. Over 1,500 were built by early 1944. But the radar faced skepticism. Many officers didn't trust it. The equipment was complex, operators needed extensive training. The displays were difficult to interpret. Most importantly, the concept of automatic tracking seemed too good to be true. Officers wanted visual confirmation before firing. They wanted to see the target with their own eyes. Trusting a machine to aim your guns was revolutionary. It was also uncomfortable. The SCR-584 entered combat in February 1944 at Anzio. 2 sets were rushed to the beachhead after German air attacks had jammed and overwhelmed the earlier SCR-268 radar systems. The SCR-584 operated on a 10-centimeter wavelength. S-band frequency, 2700 to 2900 megahertz. It had a instrumented range of 40 miles against aircraft, tracking range of 30 kilometers, accuracy of 20 meters in range, and 0.06 degrees in angle. It could function day or night without optical aids. And it had a feature that nobody had fully explored. It could track anything that reflected radio energy, including artillery shells. The shells themselves were small targets, difficult to detect, but mortar bombs were different. They had fins that acted like corner reflectors. They showed up clearly on radar scopes, and mortar trajectories were nearly symmetrical parabolas. Track the bomb at 2 points, and you could calculate where it came from with remarkable precision. The technique had been demonstrated experimentally, but it had never been used operationally until Anzio. The night of February 24th, 1944 changed everything. 12 German bombers entered Anzio beachhead airspace shortly after midnight. Junkers 88s, Heinkel 111s. They came in low, following standard Luftwaffe night attack profiles. The operators at the two newly installed SCR 584 radar sets tracked them easily. Bright blips on the circular plan position indicators. Range and bearing updated continuously. The automatic tracking mode locked onto targets. The M9 directors calculated firing solutions. The 90mm guns opened fire. 7 bombers were destroyed in the first engagement. The Luftwaffe attack formation disintegrated. Survivors broke off and fled. One German pilot reported back to his squadron that the Americans had some kind of new gun-laying system. He said the anti-aircraft fire was impossibly accurate. He said shells were exploding exactly where his aircraft had been seconds before. He said night operations over Anzio were now suicide. The Luftwaffe tried again the following night. Different approach vectors, different altitudes, different tactics. It didn't matter. The SCR 584 sets tracked every aircraft. The guns fired with precision. Another 6 bombers were shot down. Within a week, German air attacks on the Anzio beachhead had effectively ceased. The cost was too high, the success rate too low. Luftwaffe commanders redirected their limited resources to targets where they could actually accomplish something. The Americans had established air superiority over the beachhead, not through fighter superiority, but through ground-based, radar-directed fire. It was unprecedented, and the German artillery observers watching from the Alban Hills took note. But the radar operators had noticed something else during those first engagements. Between the aircraft contacts, they had seen other returns on their scopes, smaller, faster, following ballistic trajectories. The operators initially thought the contacts were false returns, interference, electronic noise. Then one operator realized what he was seeing: artillery shells. The SCR 584 was detecting German artillery shells in flight. Not every shell. The radar return from a standard high-explosive projectile was too small, and the shell moved too quickly for consistent tracking. But mortar bombs were different. The fins provided a larger radar cross-section. The bombs flew higher and slower than gun projectiles, and their trajectory was nearly symmetrical, a perfect parabola. The operators reported their observations up the chain of command. Artillery intelligence officers became very interested very quickly. If you could track a mortar bomb's trajectory, you could calculate where it was fired from. The mathematics was straightforward. A parabolic curve is defined by 2 points. Track the bomb at 2 positions, and you have your 2 points. Calculate the vertex of the parabola and extend the curve backward to ground level. That gives you the firing position. In theory, the accuracy should be within 50 yards or better. In practice, nobody knew. It had never been tried in combat. The counter-battery officers at Anzio wanted to try immediately. German mortars had been a constant problem. The 8.1 centimeter and 12.1 centimeter mortars fired from positions behind German lines, short-range weapons, 500 to 1,000 meters behind the forward positions. Sound ranging couldn't locate them accurately. The mortars didn't fire long enough for triangulation. Flash spotting didn't work during daylight, and aerial observation was limited by weather and German anti-aircraft fire. The first experimental tracking occurred on February 27th. A German mortar barrage hit American positions along the Mussolini Canal. The SCR-584 operators detected the incoming bombs. They tracked multiple trajectories. They recorded range and bearing data at different points along each flight path. The data was rushed to the counter-battery plotting center. Artillery officers worked through the calculations manually, plotting trajectories on maps, extending curves backward, identifying probable firing positions. The entire process took 15 minutes. By the time firing coordinates were calculated and transmitted to Allied artillery batteries, the German mortars had already displaced. The counter-battery fire landed on empty positions, but the principle had been proven. The radar could track mortar fire. The calculations could determine origin points. The accuracy was good. What they needed was speed. Over the next 2 weeks, the procedure was refined. Operators learned to identify mortar bomb tracks immediately. Plotting officers streamlined their calculations. Communication protocols were improved. By mid-March, the time from detection to counter-battery fire had been reduced to 5 minutes. That was fast enough. The Germans didn't always displace quickly. Sometimes they fired multiple concentrations from the same position. Sometimes terrain limited their mobility. Sometimes they simply got careless. And when Allied counter-battery fire began landing on German mortar positions with uncanny accuracy, the psychological impact was immediate. German mortar crews had operated with relative impunity for weeks. They would set up, fire a concentration, and displace before Allied observers could even identify their general location. Suddenly, shells were landing on their positions within minutes of opening fire. The first few times, the Germans assumed it was luck, random harassing fire that happened to land close. But it kept happening. Too frequently. Too accurately. The pattern was unmistakable. German after-action reports from March 1944 show increasing concern about Allied counter-battery capabilities. Multiple reports mention mortars being engaged impossibly quickly after opening fire. Several mortar crews reported taking casualties before they could displace. Commanders began questioning whether American observation methods had fundamentally improved. Some reports speculated about new sound-ranging equipment. Others suggested Allied observers had infiltrated behind German lines. Nobody suspected radar. The technology didn't seem applicable. Radar was for detecting aircraft. Everyone knew that. The idea of tracking artillery projectiles seemed absurd. The shells were too small, too fast. The technology couldn't possibly work, except it did. But mortar tracking was only part of the story. The real breakthrough came with artillery shells. Unlike mortar bombs, artillery projectiles followed elliptical trajectories, not parabolic. The mathematics were far more complex. At the muzzle, a shell's trajectory is nearly flat. As it climbs, air resistance and gravity curve the path. At the peak of the trajectory, the shell is traveling relatively slowly. On the descent, it accelerates again under gravity. The curve is asymmetrical, lopsided. Calculating the firing position from an elliptical trajectory requires tracking the shell at multiple points and solving complex equations. In 1944, that required extensive manual calculation. It was theoretically possible, practically difficult, and under combat conditions, seemingly impossible. The operators tried anyway. During German artillery bombardments, the SCR-584 sets would detect shell tracks, fragmentary, inconsistent. The shells moved too quickly and were too small for reliable continuous tracking. But occasionally the radar would catch a shell at the apex of its trajectory, at the highest point, where the projectile was moving slowest, where it hung in the air for just a moment, and where the radar had the best chance of getting a solid return. The operators began recording these peak detections: range, bearing, elevation, time. The data went to artillery intelligence officers who attempted to work backward to determine firing positions. The accuracy was inconsistent, sometimes within a few hundred yards, sometimes completely wrong. The method showed promise, but wasn't reliable enough for targeting decisions. What they needed was more data, more tracking, points, better calculations, and above all, more time to develop proper procedures. They didn't have time. On March 1, 1944, the Germans launched another major counterattack. 6 divisions struck the American 3rd Infantry Division sector near Cisterna. The LX-16 Panzer Corps, 114th Light Infantry Division, 362nd Infantry Division, 26th Panzer Division, Hermann Göring Division. The assault was preceded by the heaviest German artillery barrage of the entire Anzio campaign. Every available gun opened fire simultaneously. Heavy artillery, field artillery, mortars, Nebelwerfers. The bombardment was intended to shatter American defensive positions and enable the panzer divisions to break through to Nettuno and split the beachhead. The SCR-584 operators watched their screens light up with contacts, dozens of trajectories, incoming from multiple directions. The volume of fire was overwhelming. Traditional counter-battery methods would have been useless. Too many targets, too much confusion, too little time. But the radar saw everything. Every gun firing created a trajectory. Every trajectory could theoretically be tracked back to origin. The operators worked frantically, calling out ranges and bearings. The plotting centers worked just as frantically, calculating positions, identifying battery locations, transmitting coordinates to Allied artillery. The response was massive. Every American artillery piece within range fired counter-battery missions, 155mm guns, 155mm howitzers, 8-inch howitzers, even the long toms, the big M1 155mm guns with their 14-mile range and 100-pound shells. The effect on German artillery was devastating. Batteries that had been firing freely suddenly found themselves under accurate counter-battery fire. Forward observers reported shells landing within 50 to 100 meters of German gun positions. Some positions took direct hits, others were bracketed so closely that crews abandoned their guns and took cover. The German artillery fire, which had been building to a crescendo, faltered. Batteries stopped firing to displace. Communications broke down as command posts came under fire. The carefully coordinated barrage designed to support the infantry and armor assault became sporadic and disorganized. German infantry and tanks attacked into American positions without the sustained artillery support they needed. American artillery, freed from the threat of German counter-battery fire, shifted to firing directly on the attacking formations. The assault stalled. German casualties mounted. By late afternoon, the attack had failed. The 26th Panzer Division had penetrated the outer defensive line, but couldn't break through to the main positions. Infantry divisions made limited gains, but couldn't exploit them. By nightfall, General Truscott's reserves had sealed the penetrations. The German offensive was over. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. German commanders conducting post-battle analysis were confused. American counter-battery fire had been far more effective than in previous engagements. Multiple German batteries had been forced to displace under fire. Several had taken casualties. The speed and accuracy of American targeting was unprecedented. Reports filed with 14th Army headquarters described unusually precise American counter-battery work. Some officers speculated that American artillery had significantly improved their survey and meteorological data. Others suggested better aerial observation. A few mentioned the possibility of improved sound-ranging equipment. But nobody identified the actual cause. The radar remained invisible, silent. German forces had no electronic intelligence capability to detect the SCR-584's emissions. They had no way of knowing that microwave radar was tracking their artillery shells in flight. The Allies recognized they had achieved something significant. The SCR-584's ability to detect artillery fire and contribute to counter-battery targeting was documented in intelligence reports. The technology was still experimental. The procedures were still being refined. The accuracy was inconsistent. But the potential was obvious. For the first time in warfare, artillery could be located, not by sound or flash or aerial observation, but by tracking the projectiles themselves. The implications were profound. Artillery had always been able to hide behind terrain, shoot from defilade, remain invisible to forward observers. Sound ranging and flash spotting could locate batteries, but both methods had significant limitations. They required the enemy to fire first. They needed multiple observation posts. They were affected by weather and terrain, and they took time. Radar changed the equation completely. The SCR-584 could detect fire immediately, from a single location, in any weather, day or night, and while the technology in 1944 wasn't mature enough to fully exploit these capabilities, the direction was clear. Future radars would be faster, more accurate, better integrated with fire control systems, and artillery, which had dominated battlefields for centuries through its ability to fire from hidden positions, would become vulnerable. The advantage was now with the defender, with the force that had radar, with the side that could see incoming fire and shoot back at the source. The Germans at Anzio were among the first to experience this new reality, and they had no effective counter. Their artillery doctrine, refined through 2 world wars, emphasized mobility and concealment, shoot and scoot, use terrain, displace frequently. Those tactics worked against visual observation and sound ranging. They were less effective against radar that could track shells in flight and calculate firing positions within minutes. By April 1944, German artillery activity at Anzio had decreased significantly. Batteries fired shorter concentrations, displacement became more frequent, commanders became more cautious. The risk of counter-battery fire had increased to the point where aggressive artillery operations were no longer worth the cost. The psychological advantage had shifted. Allied forces, which had been pinned down under constant German bombardment for months, now operated with relative freedom. The German guns, which had terrorized the beachhead since January, were increasingly silent. The effectiveness of the radar system remained classified. Even most Allied personnel didn't know the details. They knew counter-battery fire had improved. They knew German artillery was less active, but they didn't know why. The technology was too valuable to risk compromising. If the Germans discovered that radar was being used to track artillery, they might develop countermeasures. They might change their tactics. They might deploy their own radar systems. Operational security was paramount. The full story of the SCR-584 at Anzio wouldn't be told until after the war. The official histories mentioned improved counter-battery fire. They noted that Allied artillery had achieved superiority over German artillery by late winter 1944. They credited better coordination, improved communications, and superior firepower, all of which were true, but they didn't mention the radar. That detail remained classified for years. The men who operated the SCR-584 sets at Anzio knew what they had accomplished. They had tracked aircraft and guided guns to shoot down Luftwaffe bombers with unprecedented accuracy. They had detected artillery fire and contributed to counter-battery targeting. They had helped break the German artillery's dominance over the beachhead, but they couldn't talk about it. Not during the war, not for years afterward. The Allied breakout from Anzio came on May 23, 1944, Operation Buffalo, 5 months after the initial landing. General Truscott's 6th Corps attacked north toward the Alban Hills with over 90,000 men. The offensive was coordinated with Operation Diadem, the breakthrough at Monte Cassino. German forces, already under pressure on the Gustav Line, couldn't hold both fronts. The 14th Army withdrew from Anzio. By June 4th, American troops entered Rome. The longest and bloodiest battle of the Italian campaign was over. But the lessons learned at Anzio would shape artillery warfare for decades. The SCR-584 radar system had proven its worth in ways the designers never anticipated. As an anti-aircraft fire control system, it was exceptional. Against the V-1 flying bombs launched at London starting in June 1944, the SCR-584, combined with proximity-fused shells, achieved kill rates that seemed impossible. In the first week, 17% of V-1s entering the gun belt were destroyed. By August, the rate had increased to 74%. On August 28th, the last day, Germany launched V-1s before Allied troops overran the launch sites. 104 flying bombs were detected. Anti-aircraft batteries using SCR-584 radars shot down 64. Fighters accounted for 14 more. Only 4 reached London. The proximity fuse and the SCR-584 had effectively neutralized Hitler's vengeance weapon. But the radar's secondary capability, tracking artillery projectiles, remained largely experimental throughout the war. The technology existed. The principles were sound. The procedures had been demonstrated at Anzio. But the calculations required were too complex and time-consuming for routine operational use. Mortar tracking worked reasonably well. The symmetrical parabolic trajectories were mathematically simple. By late 1944, British and Canadian forces in northwest Europe were using SCR-584 radars for counter-mortar operations. The British called the radar the GL Mark III when it entered their service. Multiple batteries were formed specifically for the counter-mortar role. Reports indicate they could achieve accuracies of about 25 yards when locating mortar positions. That was good enough to enable effective counter-battery fire. Artillery shell tracking remained problematic. The elliptical trajectories required more sophisticated mathematics than could be performed quickly with the analog computers and manual plotting methods available in 1944. Experimental programs continued. The British deployed observation of fire radars to Italy and northwest Europe in early 1945. These were modified anti-aircraft radars used to track friendly artillery shells and provide fall-of-shot corrections. The technique worked, but was cumbersome. Tracking hostile artillery fire to determine firing positions remained beyond the practical capabilities of World War II technology. The algorithms needed to solve elliptical trajectory problems wouldn't be developed until the 1970s. That's when Hughes Aircraft Corporation created the mathematical methods that made modern counter-battery radar possible. The AN/TPQ-36 Firefinder system, entering service in 1982, could finally do what artillery officers at Anzio had attempted. It could track artillery shells, calculate elliptical trajectories, and locate firing positions with circular error probables of less than 1% of range. But even the experimental work at Anzio had strategic impact. German forces never understood why Allied counter-battery fire had become so effective in early 1944. After-action reports from multiple German artillery units describe increasing difficulties operating near Anzio. Batteries reported being engaged with counter-battery fire within minutes of opening fire. Some units reported taking casualties before they could displace. Forward observers reported American artillery targeting with impossible accuracy given the terrain and visibility conditions. The reports speculated about various explanations: improved sound-ranging equipment, better aerial observation, possible infiltration of observers behind German lines. Some reports suggested American artillery had developed new survey methods that improved their accuracy. Others proposed that captured German artillery officers might have revealed battery positions under interrogation. Nobody suggested radar. The concept seemed technologically implausible. German forces had radar, of course. The Würzburg radar was an excellent fire control system for anti-aircraft guns. German scientists understood microwave technology. They knew about conical scanning. They had tracked aircraft at long ranges, but the idea of using radar to track artillery shells and locate batteries hadn't occurred to them. Or if it had, they had dismissed it as impractical. The radar cross-section of an artillery shell was too small. The velocities were too high. The trajectories were too complex. Even if detection were possible, the calculations required would take too long to be operationally useful. These were reasonable technical objections. They happened to be wrong. The failure to identify radar as the cause of improved Allied counter-battery fire meant German artillery doctrine didn't adapt appropriately. Units continued using shoot-and-scoot tactics developed against sound ranging and flash spotting. These tactics emphasized rapid displacement after firing. They worked reasonably well against traditional counter-battery methods, which took 10 to 15 minutes to locate a battery and coordinate return fire. Against radar-based detection, which could identify firing positions within 5 minutes, the tactics were less effective, not useless. German artillery still operated successfully throughout 1944 and 1945, but the margin of safety had narrowed. The risk had increased, and artillery commanders became more cautious in their operations. The British Army's counter-battery efforts in northwest Europe demonstrated the operational value of radar-assisted artillery location. Between D-Day and the end of the war, British survey regiments established 294 sound-ranging bases and located 15,777 hostile batteries, 360 flash-spotting bases, located 4,221 hostile batteries, and the experimental radar systems, while less numerous, contributed significantly to counter-mortar operations. The combination of traditional and modern methods gave Allied artillery a decisive advantage. German artillery, which had been superior in training and doctrine at the beginning of the war, was systematically suppressed by 1944, not destroyed, not eliminated, but sufficiently degraded that it could no longer provide effective support to German ground forces in most sectors. The American experience was similar. The M1 155mm gun, the Long Tom, became one of the most effective counter-battery weapons of the war, with a maximum range of 23,000 meters, approximately 14 miles. It could reach most German artillery positions from relatively safe locations. The 100-pound high-explosive shells delivered devastating effects on target. And when combined with accurate targeting data from radar-assisted counter-battery systems, the Long Tom could silence enemy batteries efficiently. 33 American artillery battalions in Europe were equipped with Long Toms. 8 more served in the Pacific. Each battalion had 12 guns, organized into 3 4-gun batteries. The guns were towed by high-speed tractors, or Mack trucks. Setup time from travel to firing configuration was approximately 30 minutes with a trained crew. Rate of fire was 1 round per minute in burst fire, half a round per minute for sustained fire. The gun was accurate and reliable with an estimated barrel life of 1,500 rounds. German forces respected the Long Tom. Intelligence reports identified it as particularly dangerous. The combination of long range, heavy shell weight, and accuracy made it an effective counter-battery weapon. German artillery officers noted that American Long Tom batteries seemed to fire with unusually good targeting data. Shells would land close to German positions, even on the first salvo. That shouldn't have been possible without direct observation or previously registered targets. The Germans knew American survey methods were good, they knew American meteorological data was excellent, but the first-round accuracy seemed to indicate something more: real-time targeting information, the kind of data that could only come from direct observation or some form of technical intelligence. They were right. They just didn't understand the source. The Long Tom continued in service long after World War II ended. It fought in Korea. It saw service with multiple Allied nations. The basic design remained effective into the 1960s. The barrel was eventually mounted on a self-propelled chassis to create the M40 gun motor carriage. This provided better mobility and protection for the crew, but the fundamental weapon system, a 155mm gun firing a 100-pound shell to 14 miles, remained unchanged. It worked. It was reliable. And with proper targeting data, it was devastatingly effective. The combination of Long Tom artillery and radar-assisted targeting represented the future of artillery warfare. Not because of any single technological breakthrough, but because of the integration of multiple systems: survey, meteorology, communications, fire control, and target acquisition. When all these elements worked together, artillery became a precision weapon rather than an area weapon. That transformation accelerated after World War II. The Cold War drove massive investment in artillery technology. Radar systems improved, computers became faster and more capable, fire control systems became more sophisticated. By the 1970s, counter-battery radar had matured into a reliable operational capability. The AN/TPQ-36 and AN/TPQ-37 firefinder systems could detect and locate hostile artillery with circular error probables of 0.3 to 0.4% of range. A battery firing from 30 kilometers away could be located to within 90 to 120 meters. Accurate enough for effective counter-battery fire. Fast enough that hostile batteries had only minutes to displace before return fire arrived. The shoot-and-scoot tactics that German artillery had used successfully in World War II became essential for survival. Artillery that remained in position after firing was destroyed. Modern counter-battery warfare evolved into a complex game of detection, location, decision, and response. Radars detected incoming fire and located the source. Fire control systems calculated optimal counter-battery missions. Communications networks transmitted targeting data. Artillery fired suppression or destruction missions. The entire cycle, from detection to rounds impacting, could be compressed to under 3 minutes with modern systems. Artillery had become transparent. Firing revealed position. Position invited counter-battery fire. Survival required constant mobility or hardened positions. The era of artillery firing from static positions with impunity was over. The SCR-584 experiments at Anzio in February 1944 were the beginning of that transformation. The men who operated the radar systems at Anzio never received public recognition. Their work remained classified. The official histories of the Italian campaign mentioned improved counter-battery fire in general terms. They didn't explain how it was achieved. The radar operators themselves were mostly enlisted men, technicians, specialists in a new and poorly understood technology. They did their jobs. They tracked aircraft and guided guns. They experimented with shell tracking when ordered. They recorded data and passed it to artillery intelligence officers. Then they moved on to the next battle. After Anzio came the drive to Rome, then the Gothic Line, then the final offensive into northern Italy. The war ended. The operators went home. Most never told their families exactly what they had done. How could they explain tracking artillery shells with radar when the concept itself seemed impossible? The technology they pioneered became routine decades later. Modern armies take counter-battery radar for granted. Every major military force fields some version of weapons locating radar. The capabilities the SCR-584 operators struggled to demonstrate experimentally in 1944 are now basic requirements. Detect incoming fire, calculate origin, transmit coordinates, engage with counter-fire, all accomplished automatically within seconds. The soldiers operating these systems probably don't think about the SCR-584. They probably don't know about Anzio. They probably don't realize that the techniques they use were first attempted 80 years ago by technicians working with experimental equipment under German artillery fire. But the Germans at Anzio knew something had changed. They couldn't identify what. They couldn't explain how American counter-battery fire had become so effective. They couldn't understand why their batteries were being engaged so quickly and accurately. All they knew was that artillery operations that had been relatively safe in January had become dangerous by March. Positions that should have been hidden by terrain and distance were somehow being located and targeted. The comfortable assumption that artillery could fire from behind the lines with impunity was no longer valid. Something had fundamentally changed in the nature of artillery warfare. And that something terrified them. German artillery doctrine emphasized that guns must be positioned where they cannot be observed by the enemy. Use terrain, use distance, use camouflage, fire from concealed positions, and displace before counter-battery fire arrives. These principles had governed artillery operations for centuries. They were based on a simple reality. If the enemy cannot see you, they cannot target you effectively. The SCR-584 broke that rule. It didn't need to see German artillery positions. It could track German shells in flight and calculate where they came from. The observation was electronic, invisible, unstoppable. And for forces that had built their entire artillery doctrine on the assumption of operating from hidden positions, the implications were devastating. This is why the title of this story, while dramatic, contains an essential truth. German commanders at Anzio were genuinely shaken by Allied counter-battery effectiveness in early 1944, not because individual German batteries were destroyed. Artillery losses, while significant, weren't catastrophic. but because the fundamental rules of artillery warfare seemed to have changed. The safe distance from which German guns could fire and support ground operations was no longer safe. The careful positioning that should have protected batteries from observation wasn't providing protection. Counter-battery fire was arriving faster and with better accuracy than doctrine said was possible. Something the Germans couldn't see or understand was targeting their artillery, and there was no defense against it. The reality was more nuanced than terror. German artillery continued to operate effectively throughout the war. The radar-assisted counter-battery methods used at Anzio remained experimental and weren't widely deployed. Traditional sound, ranging, and flash spotting remained the primary methods of artillery location, and German artillery doctrine, while challenged, still worked reasonably well with proper execution. But the future direction was clear. Technology was making artillery increasingly vulnerable. The radar experiments at Anzio were primitive first steps towards systems that would revolutionize warfare. The Germans couldn't fully understand what was happening in early 1944, but they understood enough to be deeply concerned. Their artillery, which had been one of their most effective weapons since 1914, was becoming less effective, less survivable, less able to dominate the battlefield. The age of artillery supremacy was ending. The age of counter-battery radar was beginning. The SCR-584 radar sets that served at Anzio continued fighting through the rest of the war. Some went to England to defend against V-1 flying bombs. Others followed Allied armies through France and Germany. Many were shipped to the Pacific Theater, the Philippines, Okinawa, Iwo Jima. Everywhere the radar went, it proved its worth against aircraft. The anti-aircraft mission remained primary. That's what the system was designed for. That's what it did best. The experimental work tracking artillery projectiles remained a secondary mission. Interesting, promising, but not yet mature enough for routine operational use. That would take another 30 years and the development of digital computers capable of solving complex trajectory equations in real time. But the lesson of Anzio endured. Technology could fundamentally change warfare in unexpected ways. A radar system designed to shoot down aircraft could also track artillery shells. The implications weren't immediately obvious. The full capabilities weren't immediately exploitable. But the direction was clear. Electronic warfare, precision targeting, real-time intelligence, integration of sensors and weapons. These concepts that would dominate late 20th century warfare were first demonstrated in primitive form on the Anzio beachhead in February 1944. The German artillery officers who experienced inexplicably accurate American counter-battery fire were witnessing the future. They just didn't know it. All they knew was that something had changed. Something was targeting their guns with impossible speed and accuracy. Something invisible, something they couldn't counter. And that unknown capability, more than any specific losses, shook their confidence in artillery operations. The Battle of Anzio cost the Allies nearly 69,000 casualties. Americans suffered 24,000 combat casualties. British forces lost 10,000. Another 37,000 were hospitalized for non-combat injuries, malaria, trench foot, battle fatigue. The beachhead that was supposed to enable a quick breakthrough to Rome turned into a 5-month siege. German casualties totaled approximately 27,500. The battle was brutal, costly, inconclusive for months, but it tied down German forces that were desperately needed elsewhere, and it provided a testing ground for new technologies that would shape the future of warfare. The SCR-584 was one of those technologies. It didn't win the battle alone. Artillery, infantry, air power, naval gunfire support all contributed to the eventual Allied victory. But the radar's contribution to counter-battery operations, while limited and experimental, demonstrated possibilities that would be fully realized decades later. The German artillery that dominated the Anzio beachhead in January and early February was increasingly suppressed by March and April, not eliminated, not destroyed, but forced to operate more cautiously, more briefly, with less effectiveness. Part of that was Allied numerical superiority, part was improved tactics, and part was radar-assisted counter-battery targeting that German forces couldn't understand or counter. When Allied forces finally broke out of the Anzio beachhead in May 1944, they did so with artillery superiority. American long-toms could reach German positions throughout the depth of the defensive zone. British medium artillery could suppress German batteries. And the experimental radar systems could help locate targets when traditional methods failed. The combination was decisive. German 14th Army withdrew to avoid encirclement. The road to Rome opened, and the longest battle of the Italian campaign ended in Allied victory. The SCR-584 radar operators packed up their equipment and moved north. The next battle awaited. The next targets awaited. The war continued. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.